First, let's look at variables. Variables are just names that have values that you'll use later in your code. Now, I'm going to summarize the syntax here, but I want to point out that for this section, variables, the next section, operators, and the following section, introduction to the basics of functions, I'm going to give the basics on a slide just so you have something you can come back and refer to on the screen later. But the details and the really important stuff I'll give in the interactive example that I'll do in Firebug. So don't worry if you don't understand every last little piece of syntax I put in this slide. I'll illustrate it very shortly interactively. Okay, you use var to introduce variables, both global variables, that's all we have right now, but very shortly we'll introduce functions, and we'll see that inside the functions we can also introduce variables, and that we also use var. I have a little exclamation point here because most modern programming languages forbid global variables, variables that are known everywhere. JavaScript is an exception to that. JavaScript is also different from most other programming languages in that when you define a variable, you just say var. You don't say what the type of the variable is. You don't say this variable is a string. This variable is a whole number. This variable is an array. This variable is a decimal number with decimal places after the main number. Or this variable is an object. You just say it's a variable and you give its value. Some people say, oh, that means that JavaScript is untyped. And often you'll see people refer to JavaScript as an untyped language, but technically it's a dynamically typed language. The idea is that you don't declare the types, but dynamically as you're running the code, JavaScript figures out the type. So JavaScript has to know it's a number or a string or an array or an object in order to do the proper operations, but you don't have to say that when you declare the variable. And this is very natural to new programmers. But people who come from C++, from Objective-C, from regular C, from Java, from C# are so used to defining the types of variables that they think it's a little bit strange. Okay, so here's some quick examples, but again, I'll illustrate this in a lot more detail interactively in Firebug momentarily. So I can say I have a variable called firstName whose value is the string Jane. Notice I use quotes. I can use double or single quotes to make a string. And one of the ideas is make the names for your variables meaningful. So I use firstName. I don't say Q. So that later on, when you go back and you read your code and you see that variable, you say, oh, that's what I was using it for. I was storing the first name of the customer that's making the order or something like that. So in this case, the firstName variable has a value Jane. It's a string. In the next line, I said price, and the variable called price is a number. I didn't have to say the first one was a string and the second one was a number. I just gave values that were strings or that were numbers. You also have these things called Boolean values. Boolean values are true or false, yes or no. It's just, is it discounted? True. Is it discounted? False. So that's called Boolean. Most languages call that. It just means yes or no. So you can have strings, you can have numbers, you can have Booleans, and we'll see two other types. Arrays that have square brackets and objects that use curly braces. Those are types as well. We'll cover those later. And in fact, functions in some sense are a type. We'll cover that later in this section. All right, so you use var to introduce variables. And just as a quick aside, there also are comments. So if you have two slashes in a row, then the rest of that line is ignored by JavaScript. And it's a very good idea in your code, if you're doing something that's not obvious, to explain what you mean, so that you or another programmer who comes along later can maintain and modify your code. So what do you mean, for instance, by firstName? Because in some countries, the family name comes first and the given name comes second, so I'd be Hall Marty. And in other countries, the given name comes first and the family name comes second, so I'm Marty Hall. So if you declare the firstName variable, you might say, oh, in a comment starting with two slashes on the same line, I mean firstName in, this convention, the given name. You can also have comments that start with /* and end with */. The difference is those comments are allowed to span more than one line, whereas comments that start with two slashes are only on a single line. All right, that's the basic syntax. That's a quick summary, but let's try it in action to see more detail. So to test things out interactively, I first launch a web browser. I go back to either my development environment or the folder that contained the simple HTML file that we're going to use for testing. I drag that onto the browser. I launch Firebug because I configured it to come up in a separate window with vertical panels. The first time it comes up in a separate window with vertical panels the second time. And now I can experiment with how variables work. So I might say define a variable called count and make its value be 5. As we saw before, it says undefined. It's a little bit confusing. That doesn't mean the count variable is undefined. That means the result of a var statement, a line that uses the word var, that whole line doesn't have a return value. That's a little bit confusing, but if we look now at the value of count, we'll see sure enough it's equal to 5. And then we saw earlier that you could apply some operators, like time. These asterisk means times. Count times 2. 5 times 2 is 10, so it returns 10. But as we also saw earlier, multiplying something times 2 doesn't change the original variable. A variable is a name to store a value, and we didn't reassign, we didn't give a different value to that name, so count is still 5. If I want count to now be 10, I have to use the equals operator. Count equals the old value of count times 2. So look up the old value of count, that was 5. Multiply it times 2, that's 10. And then reassign it back to the thing named count. And so it says 10. Let me just double check. Count is 10. All right, let me try another variable called other count. And notice that I never defined a variable called other count. If I try to look up its value and I never defined it, I get an error. And it says, reference error, other count is not defined. I have to use var to introduce it first. So I'll say var other count. And I will assign as its initial value count. What's the value of count? 10. So what's now the value of other count? 10. To prove this, we'll type in other count. And it says 10. But now let's do something interesting. Let's reassign other count to be 13. Well, what that means for other count itself is obvious. Other count itself is now 13. But what does it mean to count? Is count 10 what it was before, or is it 13? Good question. If you've done other programming languages, you can probably guess the answer, but it's not so clear at first blush. Count is still 10. So when we did the line var other count equals count, it didn't like glue the two things together so that they're synonyms. It read the value of count, assigned it to the variable other count, but they're not glued together for all time so that changing one changes the other. They're independent of each other. Okay, so those were examples where we had variables that were numbers. You can also make variables to be strings, and strings can be enclosed either in double quotes or single quotes. We'll revisit strings later. And let's say Marty. Let's make another variable last name. We'll call that Hall. And then we'll make a third variable, full name, and it will make use of the first name. Then it will use plus. Now we saw that with numbers, plus meant addition, but as we'll see in the next section on operators, if either of the arguments, either the thing on the left or the right of a plus is a string, then instead of trying to add things, you can't add strings, you can only add numbers, it just squashes them together and hooks them up. It's called concatenation. And so I'll take a space, and then I'll hook on the last name. And if I look now at the value of the full name variable, we'll see that it's Marty Hall. Okay, so variables can be numbers, variables can be strings, and variables can also be Booleans. Numbers and strings seem very obvious to non-programmers, but Booleans seem a little odd. These are just things that are true or false. And later on, we'll use those for testing. If this thing is true, do this. If the thing is false, do something else. But we can assign a variable, test equals true. And I can say, all right, what's the value of test? It's true. And I can also say var test2 equals, and instead of just saying true or false, I can do some sort of operation that computes whether something is true or false. So back before, count was 10. So if I say count greater than 100, the answer to that is false. So it computes. Is count greater than 100? No. So the value of test should be false. Let's try it out, test2. So I'd say test2, and it's false. Okay, so variables are named things that store values that you'll use later. Most of the time, we'll use variables inside functions, but we haven't introduced functions. But you can still learn how variables work, even without knowing functions, by just trying things out interactively. Variables can be numbers, variables can be strings, variables can be Booleans. Now, they can also be objects, arrays, or functions, but we'll cover that part later.